My name's Daniel Bushell. 4 men who called this crisis and their prophecy for America coming up.
We name and shame the 12 bankers who've seized the bailout, expose the Bernie Madoffs still on the run, and reveal the Pied Piper luring America into ruin.
The Wicked Witch of the East, symbol of East Coast bankers drowning America in a sea of debt again and again. Wall Street lenders have failed every generation, time after time after time.
The bankers have been at the root of problems throughout the 20th and 21st century, very much implicated in the Nazi buildup that it continued even after World War II started. It's an unknown piece of American history in the United States. Money has gone out of productive investments and is involved in speculative investments, in leveraged buyouts, and things that produce nothing of real usefulness.
Time to put them out their misery, says one of the world's most cited economists. I sat down with Nobel laureate Ed Prescott.
No, I'm not sure why we even need banks in the fractional reserve sense. I get scared with New York, the Washington-New York connection. And who ends up subsidizing them? Taxpayers.
Fractional reserve is the Ponzi banks use today. When you give $100, they keep just 10 and gamble the other 90. In a downturn like now, bets go bad, your money gets lost. It's all known as the Wall Street casino.
The world's largest gambling casino, which is what Wall Street has become. Trillions and trillions of dollars being placed on risky bets, which have already done this country a disaster and can lead us down the road, in my view, to another Wall Street bailout.
Russia's Bernie Madoff is Sergei Mavrodi. People put a third of the national budget in his Ponzi. Some made a packet before it went bust. Mavrodi told us his and Madoff's pyramids are exactly the same as banks, only difference they're legalized, but they're now bust as well. Legendary investor Jim Rogers also says banks are Ponzi's, and so is the Fed. He joins us now. 12 years ago, Greenspan ignored your warning. He's fueling stock market, real estate and consumer debt bubbles. Is the Fed at least getting better now?
It's worse. They keep buying the stuff, Daniel. If everything was resolved and everything was okay, why would they keep buying? The Federal Reserve announced, last week, that they're now going to buy another over $500 billion a year of this stuff. They've been buying about 500. They're going to buy $1 trillion a year of this stuff going forward. Does that sound like it's solved to you? If it was solved, they wouldn't have to do this anymore. Most of the people at the Fed are incompetent. You probably know that. Back in 2008, the chief economist for the Federal Reserve wrote that he said there are all these critics who say that housing in America is in serious trouble, is going to collapse and cause problems. He said, we have over 1,000 of the best economists in the world working for us, and none of us think anything's going to go wrong. He wrote this down in 2008, just as the world was about to collapse, and everything he and his 1,000 experts said was wrong. They were wrong. They were totally wrong. The world collapsed, and they said it would not. Why do we listen to these guys? Why do we employ them? Why do we pay them? Or get rid of the central bank? I'll make myself clear.
Your warning to America, if it doesn't stop the banks, will China simply overtake?
America is now the largest debtor nation in the history of the world, Daniel. It's already been overtaken. Let me repeat. In 25 years, we've gone from a creditor nation to the largest debtor nation in the history of the world. How much more money can we print, Daniel? The world's going to run out of trees. Let's say that somehow they get through 2013 and 2014. The one in 2019-20, there's no way. No way America can survive that time around.
Steve Keen was voted by economists the first person, long before Rubini, to give clear warning of the global financial crisis. How was it obvious to you?
This has all been totally counterproductive. When it's allowed to finance speculative objects like collateralized debt obligations and so on, it's like you and I both taking out borrowing money to gamble on whether our next door neighbour's house will burn down. That gives us both an incentive to burn our neighbour's house down.
What must Americans change, and what will happen if they don't?
I'm quite pessimistic about change in the medium term because you're quite right, the finance sector just dominates politics in Washington completely, and even after one whole term of this, Obama is still, hasn't broken away from the finance sector. And I think neither will his successor necessarily. When Roosevelt came in, he then took on the banks directly, and if you read his inauguration speech, it was all about throwing the moneylenders out of the temple. So it takes a change like that. Heads of banks, real estate agents who falsified documents, mainly heads of banks. There are lots and lots of people inside banks who, if they didn't know they were engaged in fraudulent activity, deserve to be in jail for incompetence, let alone criminality. So, and if you look back at the savings and loans crisis back in the 1990s, Bill Black, who was the administrator back then, put about 300 people behind bars. Now, the savings and loans was a far smaller catastrophe than subprimes, but after the subprimes, the only person behind bars is Bernie Madoff.
The Bernie Madoffs of the Fed know they're in a corner. That makes them particularly dangerous. Congressman Ron Paul.
The Fed is working frantically. They're editorializing. They've hired a lobbyist. They do not want us to know what they're doing, and they use all kinds of frivolous arguments why the Congress is not allowed to know what they're up to.
The Fed says the bailout's costing just $1 trillion. Mainstream media quotes 7. We've obtained the documents the Federal Reserve has tried to keep secret for years, showing the real figure is $29 trillion. That's twice the value of everything produced in the US in 2012. 80% of that stash is going to just 12 banks in bed with the Fed.
Bankers sitting on all of the regional feds. This, to me, smacks of enormous conflict of interest.
Randall Wray warned years ago the Fed bank cartel is swelling a massive crisis. He joins us. How far has it come?
Okay, there are only 12 banks that do this stuff. Okay, the total number of banks that are involved heavily in credit default swaps and who finance their positions in assets by issuing liabilities to other banks, there are only 12 of them. They should have gone in on a Friday and said, we're going to have a holiday this weekend. We're going to go in and we're going to take all of your balance sheets. We're going to see who owes who what. We're going to net all of this stuff out. We're going to find out that these 12 banks don't owe any of the other 5,000 United States banks. They only owe each other. Force them to wind down and to net out what they owe each other and to shrink to become extremely small banks, which is what they, most of them would become. They cause repeated crises and wipe out the financial wealth of our households and firms, the pension funds. The banks, Goldman Sachs and John Paulson, who's a hedge fund manager, rigged these things. They put together mortgage-backed securities that they knew would have very high default rates, and they did. They had default rates of 80, 90%. So the whole thing was just rigged so that the hedge fund manager and Goldman Sachs could make a lot of money on effectively death. And we've gone way, way beyond that in derivatives. Some of the derivatives actually are bets on people dying, so-called death settlements. Peasant insurance, this was in the Michael Moore movie, where employers are going to win if their employees die earlier.
The bankocracy of America betting you die early brings the industry full circle. First, Jesus drove the moneylenders out. Bankers in the inferno inhabit the 7th inner ring of hell, reserved for violent sins. Now Goldman Sachs makes products they know will fail with incentives to die, yet boasts it's doing God's work. The Pied Piper of death sends America over the fiscal cliff. This is The Truth Seeker.
bankers have been at the root of problems throughout the 20th and 21st century, very much implicated in the Nazi buildup that it continued even after World War II started. It's an unknown piece of American...
Most bankers drowning America in a sea of debt again and again. Wall Street lenders have failed every generation, time after time after time.
Expose the Bernie Madoffs still on the run, and reveal the Pied Piper luring America into ruin.
The Wicked Witch of the East, symbol of East Coast. My name's Daniel Bushell. 4 men who called this crisis and their prophecy for America coming up.
We name and shame the 12 bankers who've seized the bailout.
History in the United States, money has gone out of productive investments and is involved in speculative investments, in leveraged buyouts, and things that produce nothing of real usefulness.
Time to put them out their misery.